Hello, Dr. Pereira.
Aloha. Sorry about the glitches. Thanks for being patient.
No, we're really glad you can join us via video.
So I'm sorry I'm jumping in like midstream here. Just let Rachel let me know when you're ready for me to jump in or where we're at. Thank you.
Okay, so it's 7:02 and we have a good steady stream of people that are slowly joining the webinar. So I think that just out of respect for our time of trying to keep the panel within 2 hours, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'd just like to welcome all the participants as well as all those joining us this evening from across the country and students as well in Canada, and say welcome everyone to Decolonizing Research, Indigenous Research Methodologies in Western Academic Institutions. My name is Chantal Noah Forbes, and this evening I'm joining you from Ute Tribal Territory in Park City, Utah. I'm joined this evening by my husband, Charlie Forbes, and Charlie and I are both PhD students at the California Institute of Integral Studies, as well as founders of the nonprofit, the Deepwater Initiative, that is the sponsor of this evening's events. This event is a collaborative effort between DWI and CIS, and we really hope to facilitate increased dialogue within Western academic institutions in the US around the subject and practice of Indigenous research and the use of Indigenous research methodologies and all the challenges of appropriateness and problems that come with that. Our co-organizers from CIS is Tiffany Conyon, who's representing the Student Union, and Heidi Fraser Hageman from the Center for Writing and Scholarship. Tiffany, Heidi, Charlie, and I would really sincerely like to thank and welcome our panelists for joining us this evening. Just a note to all CIS participants to please check your Canvas mailbox in the coming week, as Heidi will be sending you details for the follow-up forum discussion to this event that's going to be held next Monday. And we will be giving you access to this recording for students who were not able to participate, so that you can participate in next Monday's dialogue. A note on this evening's format: as participants are joining, I'd really like to encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat box, because we come from so many different places and a webinar is a slightly impersonal format, unfortunately. Please include your institution or organization you're coming from. If you know the territory, the tribal or Indigenous territory that you are joining us from, please mention that. And then also the other name of the city that you are joining us from. If you could please place all questions for panelists in the Q&A box so we can leave the chat open for informal discussion and for introductions. And then in a moment, I'm going to introduce our moderator to you, Dr. Nelson. She will open the evening for us. She will then introduce our first co-panelist, our second panelist, and then we're going to take a 5-minute bio break. And then we will enter our second session for the evening with Dr. Dorothy Christian, followed by a Q&A that is moderated by Dr. Nelson. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Melissa K. Nelson, who has really been a great inspiration to many students at CIS joining us this evening. And this evening, though, she is no longer joining us as a professor of San Francisco State, but she's joining us in her newly appointed role as Professor of Indigenous Sustainability in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State. And so I'd also particularly like to welcome all the students from Arizona State joining us this evening. Melissa is an Indigenous ecologist, writer, editor, media maker, and scholar activist. Prior to this position, she taught for 18 years at San Francisco State University, specializing in Indigenous environmental and California Indian studies. Dr. Nelson, as many know, is a great advocate for Indigenous people's rights, particularly Indigenous food sovereignty at a local, regional, and global level. And I will leave for Dr. Nelson to introduce her own tribal affiliations. Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Chantel, and thank you to all for being here together this evening. Buju Nindinoi Maganatug, Melissa Nelson Indigenicaz, Makunzi Gabiawik, Idash Nindigo, Nin Anishinaabe Ikwe, Piju Do Dame, Miknakwaji Wing, Nindunjiba. Amiu Miigwech. Greetings, relatives. My name is Melissa Nelson. I'm a proud member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and I come to you from the lands of the Coast Miwok in Northern California, just north of where CIIS is located in San Francisco. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. And I want to acknowledge the First Peoples of San Francisco, the Ramaytush Ohlone, the Yelamu people, their ancestors, their current communities and generations, and their future generations. I also acknowledge all of the California Native peoples of the larger San Francisco Bay Area, the Chochenyo Ohlone, Tamyan Ohlone, all the different Ohlone nations, Muwekma, Alisal, and the Coast Miwok people on the north side of the bay. And I also acknowledge all of you and the lands that you reside on and live on, to give thanks to the ancestors of place and to the future generations who are coming ahead of us. So thank you, Chimigwich. And without further ado, yes, we have so many wonderful speakers here tonight. These 4 extraordinary women who will be sharing about their work as Indigenous research scholars, doing important work with health and community and language and culture and identity, so central to the work of Indigenous studies and decolonizing methodologies. As we're at this precipice of, in higher education, of really re-examining and interrogating some of the systems of colonial disciplines and transforming them and transmuting them into ones that are more relevant for our Native communities, locally, regionally, and globally. And to share with us, first off, we have Dr. Rachel Burrage and Dr. T. Noelani Pereira from Hawaii. You're on, I believe, Oahu, one of the beautiful islands of the archipelago there. And Dr. Burrage is an assistant professor at the Myron B. Thompson School of Social Work at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her research focuses on the intersection of culture and well-being in Indigenous communities of the Americas and the Pacific. She specifically has worked quite a bit in the field of historical trauma. Joining her colleague, Noelani Pereira, is a Hawaiian psychologist born on the island of Oahu, rooted and educated and raised by Mauna Kea, her sacred ancestral places, her parents, her kapuna, her family. Dr. Pereira was educated in the Hawaii public school system, earned a bachelor's degree in sociology at the University of Hawaii Hilo. She earned her master's degree in counseling psychology from the Chaminade University of Honolulu. Dr. Pereira serves as primary care psychologist at Waimanalo Health Center, and they do wonderful work together for the betterment of their people in both clinical and cultural practices. So without further ado, let's warmly welcome Dr. Barrage and Dr. Pereira.
Well, we're getting the, thank you for that wonderful introduction. While we're getting the slides up and in full screen, I will just say a couple opening words. First of all, especially as a settler academic, I would like to acknowledge all Kanaka Maoli people who are the original and continuing stewards of these islands that I currently live on, and which Dr. Noe may talk a little bit more is currently occupied by the United States of America. We're gonna kind of be a little informal. We have some quotes and some pictures and some stories to share with you. Then, you know, we'll be looking forward to the next presentations. Dr. Pereira, do you want to add anything?
No, that was great. We're ready to go.
Okay, you get to go next on the next slide though. Okay, so next slide, please. I can also share screen if it's easier.
Are you doing the share screen?
Yeah, I think, Rachel, it will be easier because I'm doing the actions and it's not showing on your side in the
All
same
right.
way. So perhaps you can share screen from your side.
All right, I will do that. Okay, there we go.
Okay, we ready to go? Just mahalo nui, velino mai ke aloha, o wau o Noelani Pereira, noho wau ma o ahu, aka mai moko ke ave mai au. I am Noelani Pereira. I live on Oahu now, but I was raised on the island of Hawaii. So a little bit about myself in terms of who we are. I say we because in addition to working on this project with, I'm gonna just use our first names, Decolonizing, for like the doctor piece. I'm just gonna put that on the side for now. So Rachel and I, the we of us, we come with our ancestors, those who have gone before us. And so in the photograph, it introduces us as multiple generations who were raised on that aina or that land or that place that you see this photograph. And one of those little spots in that group of spots is me, amongst my cousins and our children. So just what led to this work today is all of those things you see in that image and that photograph. And each of those images come with multiple mo'oku auhau or stories, lineage stories. That's all I got.
All right, thank you, Noe. So I'm Rachel Burridge. I am currently assistant professor at the Myron B. Thompson School of Social Work in University of Hawaii at Manoa. I wanted to share again a little bit about myself. We wanted to talk about kind of who we are as people, because that's one of the most important things I think when coming to this work is to, you know, forget a little bit about the academic labels and meet people as you are. So this is a picture of me and my son, Gabriel Alejandro, who's 6, my husband Ramiro, and my mother-in-law, Milagro. And so that'll tell you right off. I am a settler. I'm also part of a bicultural family. My husband's from El Salvador. And so our son is being raised. He's bi-ethnic, he's bilingual and multicultural. I'll talk a little bit about the history of my own family when we get into talking about how we come to this work. But I am, besides a researcher and a professor, I'm a friend and a mother and a daughter and a daughter-in-law and a granddaughter and a wife. And so those are all, you know, important parts of myself that I bring to this work.
So here's some images a little bit more in depth of what has brought us to this work. And Rachel and I, along with our research team, have had many conversations about place and how that informs the work that we do. In looking at decolonizing research, one of the things that I'm continually working for myself and to be able to articulate very succinctly and in a way that is not misunderstood is that Hawaii is Hawaii. Hawaii is legally speaking not America, and that's a very difficult sentence to hear, I think, for some, and for others they're comfortable, they understand that. I mean, about early 2000s, I was maybe 2004 exposed to research that was being done looking at international status and things like how nations are colonized or occupied and the differences between that. And so just a little bit in terms of legal, political, as well as academic trajectories. It's important when we engage in research and Indigenous research to really do soul searching and be clear about our why. So like, why do we do? And so how we come to this work and why I do what I do is the image on the top left is an image of Mauna Kea and the coast. So it's taken from the airplane. My daughter and I, we need to fly to get there, which is the picture of us in this COVID time with our masks on. We need to fly to get there. But Mauna Kea is an integral part of who I am and how I am who I am. That coastline you see there in that image are places that raised us. In addition to my parents and community. So, you know, my mountain is Mauna Kea. My ocean is on the island of Oahu in Waimanalo Bay. My rivers are Kauai Nui, which in one of those deep valleys that river exists. My rain is Wakani Lehua, so it's the rains of Hilo. And my winds is the Kipu'upu'u of Waimea, which is going north from kind of the northern side of the island. And so working in community has always been central because that's who we are and who I am. And I don't come to this alone. There are many that have paved the path before us. Rachel and I got to know each other through her desire to do more research in community. And it has been a very learning and refreshing journey and challenging. So we'll talk a little bit more about those pieces as we go along.
So I wanted to share, these are all pictures of family, of various kinds of family, which I'll talk about. I was born in Spokane, Washington, grew up in partly in the Palouse River Valley. So both of those places are named for the first peoples that lived there. And the Pacific and the, mountains and the ocean and places where those two connect have always been home for me. So whether it's been there or in El Salvador, where my husband's from, we're now in Hawaii. The first picture is a picture of my mother. She was probably my biggest influence. And I love this picture because she's very triumphant. It was around the time she was working for the Absalika Nation as a attorney. She got her PhD and it didn't work out, so she went back to study Indigenous law, and that was always a passion of hers. And it's probably the last photo she actually passed away. She got cancer after that, so it's one of the last kind of like triumphant and healthy photos of her that I have. The next picture is of so another reason that I come to this work, my grandmother, my mother's mother, adopted 7 children. So 2 of my aunties, who are the older girls in the picture, are Little Shell Band of Chippewa Indians, and they, but they were adopted incorrectly by my family, and my uncle there is the youngest of the 7 kids, and then I'm the little tiny one on the end. So I grew up, with exposure to the child welfare system and to a lot of those injustices surrounding Indigenous communities in kind of an odd way, being part of this broader family. And then as I grew up and traveled and got to know, my husband's country, and, most people there identify as descendants of Indigenous people, that family became an important part of my journey. And then the last picture is me with Joe Gahn and Sandy Momper, who are my 2 dissertation advisors and mentors throughout graduate school, who really, I think, solidified my dedication to working on issues of Indigenous wellness. And that's one thing I want to share. I know there's a lot of doctoral students, many of whom are Indigenous and many of them who are not, who are listening. And especially for the folks who are not, I think, don't come from Indigenous nations. I think one of the things that I really want to get across is this is not something that you do as a project. This is something you dedicate your life to. And so the people you'll be working with, all your colleagues, and folks in the community have dedicated their lives to this. And so that is what you need to do too. And the last picture, the picture of me in my doctoral robes, is also with sweetgrass that my mentor's husband gave me. And so when he gave me that, he said something that was very powerful, which was, you have a fancy degree now, but it doesn't mean you know anything. And so that was just a reminder of, wherever you're going and whoever you're working with, like the degree doesn't matter. You need to carry yourself with humility when you do your work.
So a'ohe pau ka ike I ka halau ho'okahi. All knowledge is not taught in the same school. There are many trajectories of learning. And so looking at this project that we've embarked on, looking at health, Indigenous health, the wellness of peoples of our community, our Native peoples, we have a multidisciplinary team, if you will. We work with social work. My discipline is psychology, and that's a formal discipline. However, just Native Hawaiian healing, and that looks different to everyone. That there are like the within group differences vary more than the between group differences oftentimes. And so in understanding that not all knowledge is taught in one school, it reminds us to, it's like that sweet grass that Rachel was just talking about. It reminds us that for as much as we know, we still don't know. And so to come to our research and our project with a true willingness to be vulnerable, to be critical, to be of the highest standard and ethics. And sometimes that's rough because it's like, oh, what, you know, we have to do this and this and this. And then there's the question of whose standard and whose ethic. And so that's, I think this project bloomed out of the understanding that we're all still learning, and each of us know, we know a lot of stuff too. However, don't get, you know, too haughty and thinking that my discipline is the discipline. We also work with Dr. Carol Tickum, who is the medical doctor on our team. She also has the MPH, so Master's in Public Health, and she really brings this other angle to our research from the position of a medical physician, clinician. And so it's delightful to just listen and talk story. We call it talk story or kuka kuka about, what about this? And well, I have no idea what assessment looks like in, you know, social work. So this is what medical assessment looks like. And so we have discussions that really emphasize that, yeah, not all knowledge comes from the same school, and we have great respect for each other's discipline. Yeah.
Um, let's see, and here's our team. We'll talk a little bit more about like what the project encompasses in a minute. But there's Noi and Dr. Carol Tickum and myself. And then Kristen Caniopio, Hina Antone, and Kira Raposo are three graduate student assistants who are doing all the like hard work of the transcribing and everything. And I'll put advisors. So for this project, we didn't set up a formal community advisory council to begin with, although we did have IRB or ethics approval from the health center in the community. But as we started interviewing folks, and we're interviewing traditional healers and also clinicians that incorporate or ground their practice in Native Hawaiian understandings of health, with one of the end goals being to create a global assessment tool that can be used to inform and improve practice in clinics. But our participants, so our participants are very knowledgeable. And so one of the things is, even though we didn't have a formal advisory council, very quickly we got lots of advice during interviews and during recruitment. And so that knowledge and that wisdom and experience has all gone in, which has been strengthened the project, but we'll talk about it in terms of challenges, because it's meant like every single time we have to go back to the IRB and redo it. And so that's been. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to, that photograph that she has there of Kristen, Kira, and Hina, if you look on your screen behind them, what you see there, that's in the rotunda of the Hawaii State Capitol on the opening of Ledge. And gosh, I can't remember what year it started, but what you're looking at are Pohaku Ku'iai and Papa Ku'iai. So Pohaku Ku'iai, so Pohaku is loosely translated to rock, and Ku'iai is to mash or pound food, and the Papa Ku'iai is a board that those rocks are sitting on. And that on opening of Ledge, community farmers come and community members come and they pound taro, which is a corm, which is like in our genealogy or our life beginnings of creation story. Halawa is our ancestor, and so the importance of sustaining food, sustaining ourselves, nourishment, mind, body, and soul is really captured in that picture on so many levels, because it is, there's that political piece, there's that legal piece, there's the very real day-to-day we need to sustain and nourish. So when you look at aipono, or eating properly, I, again, loose translation, it has to do with consumption. So when research is one way, like when we review research, it's like consuming research and consuming knowledge. And is this pono refers to being proper or upright or positioned correctly. And so that image is just very powerful in that way. And in the top right, you can see someone with, you know, a video camera, and then you see people setting up lauhala mats back there, and you see the contemporary plastic fold-out stools under these wood boards, and it's just a powerful image for me to look at and to be reminded of the work that has been done and the work that continues and needs to be started or continued.
And some other folks will hopefully do that as well.
Yeah.
Two of these students, by the way, are planning on doing PhD, so very proud. So I wanted to give folks a little bit of understanding, especially for students, of our project timeline. So this is a project, it's funded, the funding comes from NIH, so National Institute of Health, but it's through a special project in which our School of Social Work and our medical school got together and solicited a big multi-million-dollar grant to develop projects related to Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Filipino health disparities. So that's what our project is funded under. And so it's a competition across our university for funding, but not beyond that. So it's a little easier to access. That said, they fund like 3 projects a year. And so we're competing, you know, this project that's really about upholding and integrating Native Hawaiian values surrounding health and improving healthcare for Native Hawaiians is competing with like folks who are doing like genetics testing and like, I don't know, the folks that are in like oceanic sciences doing that research and different things. So it's across disciplines. But just to give folks an idea of timeline. So we're here in the end of, and getting to the end of 2020. Our initial meeting with Carol Tickham and Noe and I was in the first half. It was in April of 2019. So it's been over a year and a half. And then before that, I know they were having conversations and about, you know, healthcare, about integration and doing integration in practice of traditional practices and healthcare in their clinic. And I was kind of floundering around, asking around, talking to my dean, talking to other people and saying, you know, I want to do a community project in the community. I'm broadly interested in mental health. I have experience in trauma and suicide prevention, but I'm really open to whatever community partner wants to work with me, whatever they want to work on. And so that's really important in when folks are thinking about doing Indigenous approaches. If you know, if you're not from the community, and even if you are, right, the topic, the question, all of that should be coming from the community, not necessarily just from you. And so, yeah, I talked to my dean, who then told me to talk to someone else, who then told me to talk to someone else. And then several people told me to talk to the director of Waimanalo Health Center. And so I sent an email and waited really anxiously to hear back, which was not for a while. And then it was like, okay, I can meet Friday, like at 11 and that's it. And so I went to meet with Dr. Marioneja, who's the director there, and we spoke, and she sent me over to the pediatrics department. And that was my experience. You know, there's lots of other things going on as well with this. And eventually we met for about a year. We came up with an idea, submitted a funding proposal. And then you'll see it says funding granted, project begins. They said on July 1st, okay, you're funded and your project starts now. And you know, you have a subcontract with Waimanalo Health Center, technically can't do any work on this project until then. Well, we're in almost end of October, the subcontract is still not, you know, hasn't been paid out. So that's a common kind of research experience. And then eventually this project period will end, but you know, our plan is for this partnership to continue. So again, it's not, you know, it's not just about one project, it's about building a partnership and friendships that will continue on.
So as you were discussing our timeline, I realized, like, oh my goodness, one of the huge part of our integration is working with Hawaiian healing, with using our plant and body medicine, so the Aulapa'au and Lomi Lomi. And so in our clinic, we integrate, so the MD medicine, our cultural practitioner medicine, as well as behavioral health medicine. And because there's such a huge demand for cultural health, La'aulapa'au and Lomi Lomi, Lena Albright and Kyoki Bakleon are the two of several cultural health practitioners. Lena Albright is the director of cultural health at Waimanalo Health Center. Well, we so wanted her to come and be a part of our research team, but because, you know, we're in the midst of, we actually have a garden in the back of the health center where we grow Hawaiian medicinal plants. And when families come to the clinic, we actually have practitioners going in, and out of our garden, there are teas and tinctures and different things available to families. And so that whole aspect of our integration, we just weren't able to add on a research. Well, they weren't able to add on being part of the research team, but they definitely would have been a huge asset to us. But I neglected to mention that at the beginning. So thanks for reminding me about that, Rachel.
I think we just got the 5-minute mark. So we have 2 more slides. I think we can make 2 more slides in 2 minutes each. So I'll speak quickly. There's been a lot of challenges with this project. As you can see here, Hawaii has been really hard hit by COVID, the communities here, and we're all multifaceted people. So we're dealing with homeschooling with the kids. The one thing I wanted to highlight that's been an ongoing issue is, you know, institutional review boards are not super flexible. They're not known for being flexible. And in a way that's good. But we've also run into issues of, you know, we have the original okay for the project. But when, you know, our community members that we're interviewing come and back and say, well, I want to be named in the report, and here it says I'm going to be anonymous. So we have to go back and request a revision, and that takes several weeks. And then, you know, oh, now, you know, because of COVID times, we have to put everything online. And so that takes more weeks. And so we've had a lot of talks about, you know, it's, we have to deal with all these institutional factors from the university that don't necessarily reflect the values of the community or the folks that we're, you know, interviewing. Yeah, that's kind of all I'll say, I think, for that.
I think that whole thing of reflecting our community, I think in terms of the quote unquote formal process in academia, and research, the formal process, these processes are in place for important reasons within a system. And then we have the other system of our native communities that don't operate in that formal system. And so one of the examples of, we think you should interview people in pairs. That was another IRB thing. The challenge of not being able to go and sit down and share a meal or sit in a particular place and have discussions long prior to the project. COVID, constraints. I think that was another challenge. And just being able to acknowledge like all the huge and important work that many others have done, and to be able to call research that's reflective, to that sets foundational precedents for something like this. I think that was a challenge as well. And just time constraints. Time constraints is a big one. Yeah.
Okay, and our last slide, oh, it kind of transitions. We kind of talked about this already, but we've learned a lot through this. And so we had a few words for doctoral students. So I'll try the first one. Oke kahua mamua mahope ke kukulu. So the site first, and then the building. So this is really the idea that you need to set your foundation, and then build onto that. So I think doctoral students a lot of times want to rush and do their perfect study, incorporating all the methods. But you really need to build relationships and foundation first before you, engage in a process that's going to be time consuming for the folks that you're working with. And you may not be ready to, incorporate all the methods that you want when you're a student. I would have loved to do in a project like this as a student, but I knew I wasn't going to be living, where I was studying eventually. And so, yeah, it's really important to set your foundations first.
And then the other one is "A'ohe ulu eloa ai ka pokole o ka lo." So no breadfruit can be reached when the picking stick is too short. And so breadfruit is very much a rich and sustaining fruit. And those trees grow pretty tall, and so you would need a quite extraordinary picking stick to garner those benefits. And so in the lightheartedness in Native communities we were like, oh, this one could go all kinds of different directions, but that's the nature of our people, and the resiliency in the challenge is the pain, but also the joy and the laughter. And so that's something that is very healing. And I think as a student who's thinking about embarking on this kind of work, really important to fortify yourself in a way that you continue to nourish yourself as well as contribute to a larger community, your larger community, or the human community. Really, really important.
So mahalo for having us as part of this panel. We're really looking forward to listening to everyone else.
Yes, mahalo.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel and Noelani, for the beautiful words and really modeling a partnership, a really beautiful partnership, reciprocal partnership, and pointing out some of the complexities and challenges of working within your grassroots communities and cultural systems, and then the Western academic universities with their, the budgets and timelines and IRBs, and how it's such a balancing act. And your project looks like it models balancing that very well. And thank you. And for those words of wisdom also about doing decolonizing research work and working and serving Indigenous communities is a lifelong commitment. It's not just a project. It's not something you pick up for a semester or two or even a degree, but it's a long-term, lifelong, full spectrum commitment of life and breath and labor and love. Yeah, thank you for that, modeling that so beautifully. Wonderful. To keep us moving along, we're going to have one more speaker and take a quick bio break before our final speaker. So I would love to introduce Mariel Bellinger, who comes from Toronto area. So it's quite late there, and we appreciate your time. Mariel is an artist scholar of the Syilx people, whose interdisciplinary work contributes to the growth of the arts as a method to engage Indigenous community, language, culture, and as a bridge to society through telling stories of our time. She immerses in beautiful art, films, and looks at Indigenous identity and many critical issues. So it's wonderful to have an artist scholar with us. Welcome and thank you, Mariel.
Hello,
Welcome.
everyone. Why Inche squeezed Anson, Kintil and Kamaplex with Insis Ulaut. I'm gonna share my screen. I don't know, how do I share screen? I'm not very good at this, sorry.
There'll be a green button on your bottom of your panel that says share screen.
Okay. It's given me like this. Oh, I have to authorize Zoom. Okay, so let's see if I can do this now. Here we go. Okay.
Wonderful.
So I gave you a brief introduction. That's in the Syilx language. I'm actually here on the Dish with One Spoon Treaty territory of the Mississauga, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I'm here on my doctoral studies, which is at University of York. My practice is very much centered on this particular lady. You can see my reflection in the photo. That is Marianne Greenhow. She was one of the first mixed Indigenous women in my community and was one of the first women to be displaced from the land. My grandmother and my great-grandfather, Mary Abel and Joe Abel, started this research for me before I was born. In 1968, Wendy Wickwire first started coming into our community, and my grandmother had a knack for telling stories, and so did my great-grandfather. So she ended up coming to our house for quite a few years. Over the course of many summers, her and her family would come and visit Wendy Wickwire, and they would just record. So during my undergrad, I was gifted 16 CDs of these stories. And so it led me on my post-secondary studies. I started in a performance theory, performance art program, and it kind of helped to get me to think about what I've been doing my whole life in terms of Syilx theory and performance theory. This is my mother and I when I was a child. So these things are embedded into me physically through song and through dance, where these days I'm thinking about what is actually my upbringing and how has that helped me stay alive. 5 years ago, I was in a car accident, and as it turned out, I was very severely underweight, and I was not sleeping well. So I had a manic episode and I kind of went places. Now, when I told the doctor these things, he automatically diagnosed me as bipolar. So it really made me question the medical industry, because it's an industry. And how did this man who just moved to Canada from South America or South Africa know what a vision quest looks like if it comes in contemporary times? What does it look like? So it drove me into a house, literally, where I was taken by something that saved me. So I should be dead because I literally hit a house, and I'm not. I have a broken clavicle, which has made me decide that I don't want to be cremated anymore. I want to go in a box so that they can discover me 150 years in the future or whatever, right? Because this is going to keep happening. This discovery and rediscovery of ourselves. And so that's really what led me into my master's. I'm an Indigenous woman in 2020. It's about time I get to research myself and figure out, well, what is the ethnography of all of this? You know, what is the anthropology of me? So I am that accidental ethnographer. I just discovered that literally like the other day, reading through a bunch of our new articles of academics that I don't remember their names just yet. So, you know, I'm just starting. I'm not exactly the typical student, because I'm coming from multiple intersections of colonization and decolonization. So my father was French Canadian and my mother was Sioux. That does not make me Métis. It does not, because I was born and raised in my territory of my mother, and that is the way of our people. And my father literally married in and became one of us. He just recently passed, but is recognized as being one of the most lively stick game players in our community, and someone who actually helped bring community members into the stick gaming community. And stick gaming is like a valuable community gathering where in past times, really important decisions were actually made by these games. So my whole entire life has been quite extraordinary in terms of where do I get my ideas from, and how does growing up in a bipolar extreme reality affect one person's mental health, right? So they said that I was bipolar, and I cried, and my mom kind of said to me, well, you weren't any different than I was when I was growing up. So I didn't know to see or to recognize that there was anything wrong with you. So that really told me that there was nothing wrong with me, and that the diagnosis was more about what that guy wanted to understand than what was actually happening. So I decided that I needed to make those changes. And instead of saying, no, I'm not bipolar and whatever, I said, okay, I'll subscribe and I'll figure out, you know, with you what's going on with me. So he put me on all kinds of medication, and it made me crazy. My eyeballs were jiggly. I couldn't study, and it made me cry because I couldn't study. I couldn't figure out how to focus on the pages that I was supposed to read, because this pharmaceutical medication that was for epilepsy was in my body. And it was at such a low dosage that apparently I didn't really need to take it. So I didn't understand why they were putting me on it. And so I figured I'd focus on my health and my nutrition and my sleep, because those were still things that were not quite, they weren't really in check, right? Because I'd literally just come from town after a failed marriage to a third generation Canadian who didn't understand certain cultural practices and ceremony. And so I had to separate from that. And I went back to the bush with my mom. We harvested a lot over the past 5 years since my car accident. And I've thought a lot about what it means to be in the bush with my mother and my children, so that generations of us get to feel and get to hear each other in the places that our ancestors were. And so it's a tradition for grandparents to take a strong leadership role in educating their grandchildren. This is a photo that if you type in Okanagan family, you'll find this photo, and this is my family, which is quite ironic that it's on the internet. And, you know, I can search myself literally, like I'm all over the internet too, so don't look me up. I'm just kidding. But my grandmother said to my cousin Bernie Marchand Brown, who got her master's in education, "I hope these things I teach you will be a benefit to you in your life." And they really were. Like, since the car accident, I've had a series of rememberings. And so I use art, and there's multiple modalities of art, right? Just as many as there are of academic genres, which is all too confusing because they all intersect because we're all from the same biosphere, and, you know, but I remembered things from my past, like behind me, that's a picture of me, you know, as the Pocahontas doll, in my wedding dress, because it was such an epic thing that happened to me to get married and then to have a failed marriage and think, oh my God, this is how Canada is. This is exactly why we can't survive. And I've actually had to physicalize this so that I could go into performance and perform it in multiple ways. So I chose Barbies because I like to play. Above all, playing is something that I've come to realize helps me get out of my head when I am manic, because I do admit that I have tendencies to speak too fast and to think too fast, and also to get really confused by technology. So it's like, sometimes I'm really smart and other times I'm really not. And that's the whole thing about getting a PhD, right? It's like, you think you're so brilliant and really it's like, how does this thing work? You know? So toys, teach kids how to understand situations. And play and performance and sharing stories. So this is a photo of my family and my extended family who made up the Okanagan dance troupe in the late 60s and early 70s. And so that's Mary Abel, Teddy Marchand, baby Anne Cecilia Gregoire, Victor Antoine, Jimmy Bono, Sarah Bono, Madeline Gregoire, Margie Gregoire, and Teresa Ashton. They're all extended relatives of my grandmother, Mary Abel. And my mom and I were in those performances as well. So I was taught Chaptik, animal stories, through song and through dance at a very, very young age. But after the car accident, I started thinking, well, you know, what was happening to me when I thought a deer jumped in front of my car and scared me so much that I passed out and then embodied deer. And then I'm like falling down rabbit holes of physics and metaphysics and like quantum computing, like really stuff I'd never had any interest in before. But these symbols and these patterns and these systems kept penetrating my head, to the point that I even had them tattooed on my wrists, because I understood them to be more than just ways of doing that my grandmother passed on to me. They were actually our whole ontology, like our whole universal understanding of everything. And so where's our particles of the standard model? Like, what is that for us? Those were some really big questions that in my master's I didn't have enough time for, because I was too busy still trying to figure out these things that my granny taught me about keeping family together and the importance of telling story and about the importance of keeping an art practice within the children's grasps. So this is my family, my mom and my children. All three of my children are brilliant sketch artists. I don't know how to draw. It really burns me because 2 out of 3 of them are not artists anymore. They're actually into like accounting and finances and stuff, which is really scary for an artist, you know, an artist mom who was very diligent. That's my son's first art exhibition. Like, I was very diligent. They were all going to be artists. Kids grow up and become their own people and do their own thing. All we can do is give them the frameworks and the foundations, how to identify who they are. So my middle daughter, she was very much feeling displaced from her father's family living in the Okanagan. And so I wanted to encourage her to explore what it meant to be Nukhalk in the Syilx territory. So I had her in art exhibitions as well. And I was a program coordinator for a youth center before I got into any serious kind of thinking about art. I was just thinking, how do I keep my kids from getting into trouble? What do I have to do to be there for them? And a youth worker was the best thing I could be. It also gave me the opportunity to play with education models. It makes my daughter mad, my youngest one sometimes, because she did not have a regular artist or a regular student experience. She was raised in cultural immersion school. So she's the first fluent speaker of my family since my grandmother. And my mother and her are finally able to have conversation and understanding in the house, but I'm left out because I'm of that generation that was, you know, hooked onto Murphy Brown in the 80s, thinking that the mall was going to save us, just like Marty McFly. Didn't happen that way. And I kept having to come back to the land, and I had to kept coming back to my elders. And in 2013, I dreamt of this idea that I wanted to be on the land with artists and my mom and my favorite elders who are artists, and teach the kids what it means to be on the land through story and embodiment. So in this photo is Madeline Gregoire, who was in the photo before. As a performance artist, she's also one of our respected water elders who has tremendous stories about a place called Huckleberry Mountain, which is now occupied by Silver Star Ski Hill. And my daughter is in there, and my artist mentor, colleague, auntie, everybody, Barb Marchand, who really deserves a PhD in the knowledge that she has gathered about marsh life and the importance of the marsh plants. And Robin Kruger and Dean Lewis were local artists who came and showed us, well, Dean was telling us about the land because he traveled the land and he took us to specific places. And Robin had just gotten her master's in education and focusing on art. So I needed to be around these people. I didn't know at the time, because that was before I even started my undergrad. I didn't know that I was going in this direction for a very long time. Our earlier panelists talk about it's a commitment to be working in community. It is a commitment. It's a lifelong commitment that you need to embody, and you need to be aware of you know, who you are in relation to what is around you and who's around you. So in my me search, I've thought to my granny a lot, and I wrote to her literally in my master's about where I was going and what had happened and what I had thought had happened in that time that I had the car accident. And what I had come to know is that she was doing something her whole life that she never stopped until she couldn't remember, literally until she couldn't remember who she was anymore because dementia ended up taking her. She tanned hides, and she used the brain as the membrane to soften the hide. It's a traditional hide tanning methodology. How did we know to use the brains of an animal to make something that would cover us and keep us warm and is like really actually quite amazing to have on? And so I use these ideas because prior to my MFA, I was a performance theorist, right? Like, well, prior to my MFA, I was just a performance artist, just with a career in community-based arts, right? That was my practice, community-based artist. You don't get paid a lot of money for that. So, I mean, gosh, that's so thankful that I'm an accidental ethnographer now. Maybe I'll find out some money. But my grandmother's practice of hide tanning is what really started to thread everything together for me, like the physics, the metaphysics, the science, the education, the mental health. So before, well, not before, after I had my first manic episode, I had another one, but this was into my master's degree now. And I knew I had to do something, and getting in the car was not the ideal thing to do, right? Like I was trying to find something that I wasn't sure of at the time, but something had happened. But what was already there for me was the framework of the hide tanning, right? And the framework of the hide tanning are poles. And these particular poles are the same kind of poles that we would use to build our temporary summer shelters, our tule mat houses. And when you think about our implements, they're made of all the same material. Like Dr. Sean Brigman said it to me very well and very clear one time, that an implement like a canoe is a tule mat teepee, is a basket, is a food mat, because they're made of the same material. It's just different lengths and different widths. So that's a lot of math and science, and just learning how to build and make our own implements that actually turn into a whole entire village, should we allow it to, should we give it enough space to do that. And so there are different parts to these things, right? And I started to think about, well, if I'm thinking about self in relation, what is the relationship of storytelling and informing our historical memories? So like the sinew is the threads connecting, it's the language, the hide is the landscape and the governance, and the meat is the sustenance for sharing. The tanning shed or the tanning area was the container and the nucleus for this particular activity. And the tools are the capacity and the innovation. And the deer brain is that alchemy, that chemical reaction, the action that actually happens internally in ways that, we don't understand yet until, we have our cleansing moment with the water and, you rinsing and communicating a whole new way of being. And then you stretch it, again, using the methodologies of ancestral times. So what does a Syilx family have to do to revive their grandmother's cultural practice? As a researcher and context, I always start from who am I? As the ground shifts, the fundamental pedagogy will determine the outcomes of the research. So literally, being bipolar has kind of got me flip-flopping all over the place about what I'm gonna do. And I'm fortunate that I'm high functioning. So I have what is like a negative high where I'm crashing, but everything is successful around me. And I really don't have time to fall apart and break down and stuff, right? Sometimes that's actually a motivating factor for me. This scene here was one of those breakdowns. I didn't know how much I was gonna have to dig into myself and dig into everything else to figure out what had happened in my grandmother's reality, where my mother is not a fluent speaker and I am not a speaker at all. Like, how did the breakdown happen? Well, again, back to relationship, right? There was a marriage of things. And the way that Benjamin Franklin would have you hear it was that it was just wonderful and glorious, and all of a sudden natives happened, but they weren't us. They were actually, you know, that Liberty who sprang from the prairie with her auburn hair, you know, like that native non-Indigenous person that came here and decided that we weren't people. And so it was a forced relationship. It was a forced marriage. Now, I did not force myself to get married. I got married willingly. I thought I was in love. This is what we're supposed to do. I thought I was smart because I didn't actually get married until late in life. But I think I got married because the wedding dress called me, because she fit me perfectly when I tried her on. And she was in like the tickle trunk, $500 sale dresses. Okay, she was like, she wasn't wanted by anybody except for me. And she told me that day I put her on that we have a life together and that we're gonna go places. And that was in 2012. And this was 2014, because my marriage only lasted like 12 months. It was a disaster because so much was happening at the time politically that I could not be with a white man who didn't understand that we needed space when it came to ceremony, and that campers at a provincial park in Kamloops should not be allowed to be on the campgrounds when they're repatriating bones. Like, my husband should not be the man arguing with me about that. So I had to cleanse off. I literally had to cleanse all of it because she found me and we needed to tell this story. And in this photo, I had just recently, I just before did a ceremony with my daughter and with Dr. Margot Tamez and her daughter, Aria, to mud my wedding dress and myself with the mud from my grandmother's ancestral land, from the mud from the places that I grew up as a child and played and had all of my hopes and dreams not crushed. And then I went to the water and washed myself off. I kept the mud on the dress for very many years. I went on to embody different characters in the dress. This one here is a photo taken by Chris Bose in Kamloops in Secwepemc territory. And I'm related to these territories through my grandmother and my great-grandfather and my grandfather, Edward Fred. And thinking about the symbols of place and the symbols of my ancestors and the coming of things, like this is prophetic. I didn't realize that in this 2020 that we would be wearing masks like this, and that muskrat knew it was coming. So in 2017, I was introduced to Dr. Sean Bergman, who makes Tulimat teepees, and I invited him to UBC Okanagan through a 2MS grant, a student initiative grant, to bring his teepee to to campus. And we installed it for 4 days. It was the first lodge size Chulimat teepee to be installed in the North Okanagan. Like, I don't know when the last time was. It was quite monumental for me personally, because within the photo is my daughter and her ex-boyfriend now, sadly. But anyway, it was the beautiful image of a family unit, a traditional family unit, where the parents are teaching the next generation of parents how to put up a very important home. And these homes were very, very important to Syilx woman, because this is where her first belongings began. She made this herself. This is her architecture. Because we were the keepers of all of the village happenings. We were the keepers of the implement, the handheld implements. We were we were the ones who decided what was happening in the village, because we were the ones also taking care of the children and taking care of the elderly, making sure that there was enough food. Like, we had to be some pretty smart bean counters to be counting all the food that was needed to sustain us over the whole winter, like, hands down, we were doing a lot. I'm not saying that the men were not doing a lot either, but what's his name? Spokane Gary had women build his schoolhouse, and it was Chulimat teepees, so even way back then, the men were relying on us to make sure that there was a space that they could come to educate, to teach, right? It was already happening in the village life. And so what do I do now as an Indigenous woman with all of this artistic knowledge in community-based arts? How do I bring that forward to be taken more seriously? Because currently, I feel like people don't understand that theater is not acting. There's a whole philosophy behind it that's multimodal, and you would learn a lot to be, I don't know how to, if I have no time left or what, but we learn a lot from understanding the practices of Syilx women in village life. And that's pretty much where I'm going with my practice now, is through sculptural, through education, through performance, and through rites of passage for teenage transformation. There's been a lot happening in the North Americas, in the South Americas, a lot of upheaval, a lot of fighting back. Across Canada is there's a lot happening. And how do we change that? Because the current education model does not actually give us opportunity right now, right? It really doesn't. It's all very cyclical. It's all very it's all segregated. How are we supposed to teach wholeness and unity through segregation? So what did I miss growing up? I think the main things that I missed growing up was having a sense of what is my responsibility, and how do I make things for myself that as a child I've started playing with to feel like they're playthings and not work things, right? We used to sing a lot in the bush as we were harvesting berries, because safety, it kept the animals away, but also because things came to us in those places, songs came, and they're specific to place. There's a very, oh, did I miss something? There's a very important method that's being lost to classroom education, and that's land-based learning. This Chulimat teepee was a part of an exhibition in the Kelowna Art Gallery in 2019. It was my very first Chulimat teepee. It sat in an outdoor gallery for 3 months over a course of an Okanagan summer, which is supposed to be dry because we're supposed to be like Northern California, but it was not. It was like one of the wettest summers on record. And so you can see it got like weathered, and it looks gorgeous in its weathering. And just this last fall, I was able to witness our mats in actual use on a adventure series that's going to be on like in the States. You'll be able to watch it on Maori TV online. It's called Merchants of the Wild. But it's like I got to watch our material get beaten up by these participants who didn't know how to use it, but understood the value of having it in their shelters because it kept them warm. Like tules are a reed that is populated in the marsh. I mean, one of the things that really made me cringe about the Trump campaign is that he would say things like drain the swamp. Well, like the swamps literally keep our water clean. Like, why would you do that? And we also need these places. Like they've totally made these places, they've erased Indigenous women's place, right? The marshes were a gathering place of ours. And so going back to my great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann and Mary Trees Greenhow, they were of a place like that. And it's called O'Keefe Ranch. And it's like the historical place in the North Okanagan. They were the first to be affected by colonization. They were taken off of their marsh. Okanagan Indian Band Reserve number 2 is at Otter Lake. When I had my car accident, I was told I need to go to Otter Lake. I didn't know I was going there. That's where I didn't know why. Those people were there is what I was told. I didn't know which people until I got there and started crying because they spoke to me once I started harvesting them. They told me all about why I need to calm myself in my mania and how to do it with a harvest and how to do it with a weaving. A lot of Indigenous people bead for a reason because it calms you down. It's like one of those mind controlling things where you're able to just forget it all and focus on what's in your hands. And I've come to realize that as somebody with mania at times, I need to switch my focuses a lot. So that's why I'm like all into everything. I can't just be a performance artist because holistically, I'm not. Holistically, I have to be a creator of implements. I have to know what it feels like to poke myself with an awl after making a basket and wonder how my grandmother did these things. Otherwise, I would not have these questions. So our young people need to have these questions too. And that's where I'm starting with my PhD. And that's pretty much my presentation.
Ah, wow, Mariel, thank you so much. Powerful stories and images. I love the tule teepees in your wedding dress. Incredible. Love seeing the intimacy of your ancestors and your descendants, your families, and the beautiful creative art you're doing for your own me search. A really powerful example, Miigwech. Thank you. Excellent. We have one more speaker, but do we need to take a 5-minute bio break or a 3-minute bio break? I think that would be very helpful for our embodied learning and embodied knowing. Great, let's take it's 25 after the hour, wherever we are. Let's be back in 5 minutes and we will move on with Dorothy Christian. Thank you so much. See you in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back. Thank you for staying with it. I know it's late for some people and earlier for others, but what powerful presentation so far. And we are going to end last but not least. We're so grateful to have Dr. Dorothy Christian with us for the final presentation tonight on this important topic of decolonizing research methodologies. Dr. Dorothy Christian is of the Secwepemc and Silks peoples from the interior of British Columbia in Canada. Her home community is the Splatsin, is one of 17 communities that comprise the Secwepemc Nation. She's the eldest of 10, has one daughter and over 60 nieces, nephews, and great nieces and nephews. So rich and beautiful relatives. Dr. Christian currently serves as the Associate Director of Indigenous Initiatives at the Teaching and Learning Center at Simon Fraser University. Her research in academia has consistently centralized Indigenous knowledge, even before those terms were recognized in the academy. She had a double major for her undergraduate degree in political science and religious studies at University of Toronto. And she holds her master's degree from Simon Fraser University School of Communication and her PhD in the Department of Educational Studies at University of British Columbia, which focused on Indigenous visual storytelling and filmmaking practices. Welcome. We are so happy to have you share with us now. Thank you. Dr. Dorothy Christian.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here with you all and grateful to the organizers, to Chantal and Charlie and Heidi and Tiffany for bringing us together for this really important discussion. And I feel really good to be in the same Zoom room with all these women. I've read some of your work, Melissa, and I use some of it for my research. And aloha to the two women from Hawaii, and Tiffany and Heidi. And of course, Marielle is my niece. I consider her one of my nieces. So I've followed along with her in her work and in her journey, and feels good to be in the same Zoom room, even though you're 3,000 miles away. And I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge the people and the lands where I live. I am of Secwepemc scale ancestry, as Melissa pointed out. And however, it's like I always say that I'm living on the lands of my Coast Salish cousins. And that's the Tsewitooth, the Musqueam, and the Squamish. But also, depending on which campus you're on with Simon Fraser, it could be the Coquitlam as well as the Katzie. So, and I worked throughout all those campuses, but the main campus is on Burnaby Mountain. So I just wanted to take that time. I think it's a very exciting time in academia right now for Indigenous knowledge. And I feel that it's time, you know, that Indigenous scholars bring forward the knowledge that we have to share, but under our terms. So I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully I can do that without too much trouble. And where is it? Here we are. Whoops, can you see it?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
You can do full screen.
Yeah,
Yep.
full screen. As you can
Perfect.
see, I mean, my subtitle for my presentation this evening is what horse did I or you ride in on? We come from a horse people, Marielle and I. And so it's always good for me to use images and thinking from our own people. So my research is always, it's the story of the land. And I've contextualized it in terms of the Indigenous narrative versus the colonial narrative. And all of us Indigenous peoples have had cultural interruptions, which one of my brothers calls legislated genocide. And I'm sure you all know about these things, our spiritual practices being outlawed, and that we were banned from having more than 5 people gather. We were not allowed to hire lawyers. This is in Canada now. And so just to be specific about that. And men and women lost their status as an Indian if they served in the military. They also lost their status if they decided to go to university. And so on it goes. And I'm sure you all know the story of the residential school in the 60s scoop, which have had a direct impact on my life, intergenerationally and directly. So I don't know how many of your students are aware of the horrible history that Euro-Western institutions, higher institutions have had with Indigenous peoples. Their approach has always been very ethnocentric and very creating an attitude of superiority of Euro-Western knowledge system over any other system of knowledge. It's been disrespectful, absolutely, to Indigenous peoples. It's been very exploitive. And a term that I have come up with through my so-called activism is talking about cultural appropriation, where some of our stories were literally stolen from our Indigenous nations. And in my Secwepemc nation, we have, and in Marielle's as well, we have had non-Indigenous academics come into our communities and literally copyright some of our stories under their own names. You know, so that's the kind of history that we have with the higher educational institutions in Canada. So when I talk about what horse did you or I ride in on, you know, in academia, we call it location. For Indigenous peoples, it's where are you from? And who am I? What horse did you come in on? You know, so when researching, we have to ask more in-depth questions. I do that in 3 domains: culturally, professionally, and academically. More questions. When do you use the appropriate domain? And how do we negotiate overlapping domains? So am I my ancestors? This is my great-grandpa, the one that's seated. Am I the land? This is my mountain that's right next to my community. And I don't know the Indian name for this, but the white people have named it the Enderby Cliffs. Am I the plants that grow on my land? Am I the salmon? So who am I in all the domains? In the cultural realm, I've been impacted, of course, by colonial interruptions. All of us have experienced the forces of external colonial forces. I've been affected by residential schools because my mother and my uncles and my aunt went. Thankfully, my grandparents who raised me, because I'm the eldest of and the first grandchild, my grandparents did not go to any white man's education system. And I was raised by them for the first 4 years of my life. which is probably what makes me so hard-headed. You know, it's, I look at the world in a whole different way. And I was put into foster homes when I was a teenager. And so I lived in 6, I just got my records recently. I lived in 6 white foster homes in 5 years. And every foster home I was in, I ran away and I hitchhiked home to my granny to let her know where I was. And then I would turn myself back into the social workers. But I always made sure that my granny knew where I was, you know, so. And I started when I was living in Ontario. I moved to Ontario in the early 70s with a husband, and promptly got divorced after that. But I stayed there on the land, and I was very highly influenced in my reclaiming of my Indigenous self by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, and the Sioux peoples. And I moved back to my own territories in 1995. So in terms of cultural practices, I was attending ceremonies when I lived in Ontario with the Medewan people. I also carry a Anishinaabe name, and I was adopted into a clan while I lived on those territories. And I also attended Haudenosaunee Longhouse gatherings. And on my own, I started working with a medicine man in South Dakota, North Dakota, actually, in Bear Butte. I was fasting there starting in 1990. And by the time I moved back to my own territories, I was fasting in my own community and on my own lands by the mid-90s. And since then, I've become a sun dancer. And I carry a shawl for the Red Shawl Women's Society. And so I am there as a teacher of the women, and I help to uphold the women's side of the lodge. And professionally, as Melissa explained, I worked in the film and television world for a number of years, in fact, for 8 seasons. And that's a long time for TV. You know, so in that time, I managed to accumulate over 100 professional production credits. And I was so privileged to be able to travel throughout Turtle Island and into Mexico to bring Indigenous stories to the national screen culture. So in this country, I'm categorized as a visual artist. So I call myself a visual storyteller. And I do have one independent film. It's called A Spiritual Land Claim. And so that's who I am professionally in the Sama world, you know. And in academia, Melissa talked about all of those degrees and where I was did my BA, MA, and my PhD. So I won't go into that, but I will talk about my PhD research, which I applied a metaphor, which is my Secwepemc name, Huchla. And there's a story that goes with the name, that name, because the old ladies in my community observed me for about 10 years before they gave me that name. Because I had been away for so long, you know, they knew me as a child, but when I came back, I was an adult. So they had to see who I was. And so they said that they decided to name me this, and this is a bird in our stories who is the meadowlark. And what was explained to me was that she's the character in our stories who flies all over the place. And then she comes back and she tells the people what's going on in a very loud voice. So they blessed me with that name. So I feel like I have a responsibility to live up to it and take care of this name. So I called my PhD research Gathering Knowledge. So it was Huchla flying all over Turtle Island, gathering knowledge from all these different nations. So Indigenous methodologies of land, place-based visual telling and visual sovereignty. So I see filmmaking or visual storytelling as a contemporary form of knowledge production. I also see research as storytelling, and Indigenous story work is used to make meaning for those stories. So cultural protocols are just on the, I mean, there's some, Australia has cultural protocols in terms of how they deal with Australian stories. We do have cultural protocols here in Canada, but I don't know how they're being implemented provincially, because our situation here is very different than it is out east. So land, story, cultural knowledge, and language are all central to my research. And I spoke with 30 people, knowledge keepers and visual storytellers, all from Turtle Island. I had one Hopi and one Inuit, Zacharias Canuck and Victor Masaisva from Hopi. My study is a qualitative multi-generational study. So I had people like right from their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and Alanis Obamsawin, who was 84 at the time. So I think she's 87 now. So when I talk about my research, I say that I wrote within an Indigenous research paradigm. And what that means is that I privileged Indigenous knowledges while I incorporated critical non-Indigenous scholars. And I used a talking in approach, a coined term by Barry Barkley, the Maori filmmaker. So this was an Indigenous to Indigenous conversation. I purposely did not engage the colonial framework. I'm really tired of the colonial framework. So it's like I wanted to be able just to talk to other Indigenous people and do some collaborative thinking and sharing and conversing just about all the various things that we were doing, which is why I purposely ignored the colonial framework and privileged Indigenous way of thinking and doing and acting. So more on my research paradigm, all it means is that I wrote and researched from my Secwepemc scale holistic worldview. I wrote in 4 voices. I challenged the institution in terms of how I presented my work academically. So I wrote in different size fonts. I wrote some of it left margin, some of it right margined. I included some of my dreams. I included experiential knowledge. I did all kinds of things. So the mind, of course, was the scholar, right? So with the heart, I considered that the silent voice, because that's the voice that synthesizes and gives the emotion to all of these other voices. So again, central is land, story, cultural protocols, and language. So I focused my research on globalization and global film theory. And I was particularly interested in concepts that had to do directly with the land. Deterritorialization, which is a really fancy way of saying how they ripped us away from our land. So, so I'm very fortunate that I have Indigenous scholarship from both Secwepemc and Scale nations. So Ron Ignace, Catherine, Michelle, Janice, Billy, Jeanette Armstrong, Billy Cohen, and Marlo Sam. They all have their PhDs in various disciplines within the Academy. And of course, I used other Indigenous scholars in Canada, Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, Inuit, And globally, I really focused on Maori people, and especially when their work had to do with film. And I also worked with some of the critical film theorists in Canada, US, and Germany. So when I talk about methodologies, it's really complex accountabilities for me as an Indigenous researcher. You know, non-Indigenous researchers may think that it's easier for us, but in fact, it's not. You know, I mean, people are just as suspicious of me as they are of non-Indigenous scholars. It's like they really have to see whether they can trust you or not. And luckily, I mean, maybe that's why I was in the film and television industry for all those years. It's like I had built relationships with many of those Indigenous filmmakers and visual storytellers. So when I called and asked them to be a participant and went and sat and talked to them about the things I wanted to talk about or examine or research, I didn't have any difficulty in getting people to agree to be a participant. So one of the accountabilities was to my own community. I went and did a presentation to my chief and council and also to the elders community. In my community, there's an elders center. So I went and made a presentation to them, you know, and what made it so complex was the accountabilities that I felt to all the nations that I had conversations with. So if you go to my methodology chapter in my PhD, you'll see how I've broken it down. So as I said, I spoke with knowledge keepers and visual storytellers from Secwepemc, Tanaka, Swampy, Cree, Six Nations, Mohawk, Ganawagi, Mohawk, Seneca, Anishinaabe, Inuit, Hopi, Abenaki, Anishinaabe, Cree, Cree Soto, and Plains Cree. And some of you may wonder why I would identify or make a distinction between Cree and Swampy Cree or Swampy Cree and Plains Cree. It's because they're located in different parts of North America. So each one of those individuals that I spoke to identified specifically where they are from. So that's why I use those specific terminologies. So when I talk about Indigenous methods, I asked a number of people, some of my knowledge keepers, to be an Indigenous advisory for me during my research process, just to keep me in check, to make sure that I was doing things in a good way. And I used the conversational method. Margaret Kovash talks about that in her book, in terms of sitting down and having conversation rather than sitting and interviewing as if I was doing an interview for television, you know. And I really made a point of, as many of the knowledge keepers and visual storytellers, as many as possible, I actually went and spent a few days with them on their land, because I needed to feel, and it's when Marielle talks about embodiment, right? I needed to embody their aesthetic. So when they were speaking to me about aesthetics, I wanted to be able to feel what they were talking about. I also kept a journal, which is, again, what Marielle's talking about when she talks about experiential and lived experience as knowledge. So she's been her own ethnographer. And I also used what we call the reflexivity method, you know, which meant that, how I can explain that. so I recorded all of my interviews. And so when I was driving, I'd be on a road trip and I'd put on their interview and I would listen to it. So I listened to each interview probably about 5 times. And each time I would react, I would have a deeper understanding of what they were talking about. And some of them shared really intense knowledge from their cultures. And I also employed synergy and interrelatedness. It's all about the relational quality of Indigenous knowledge. And I used active listening with 3 ears. So, and inward knowledges as a method. And again, that's what Marielle is talking about when she talks about her experiences in terms of her arts practice. Now, one of the things that I did at the very beginning of my dissertation was, in the preface, I said that I understood that the university gives me copyright over this PhD research. I said, however, I do not claim copyright of any of the Indigenous knowledge that has been shared with me, that people had to get in direct touch with those nations if they wanted to use any of that information, that they needed to be respectful and ethical in terms of how they treated that knowledge from different nations.
So here's my little guy. He's sending you guys smoke signals from Vancouver. And I just want to wish you guys all good luck with your course. And
and with your research. That's it. Tout fini.
Wow, that was extraordinary. Thank you so much. Beautiful,
Oh,
beautiful presentation.
Now, how do I, I
Wow.
stop share. There we are.
Ah, yeah, great. There we all are. Wow, thank you. Such a beautiful model of Indigenous research from the ground up, from the heart, from the inside out, from the community to the university, from all over Turtle Island to, yeah. Wow. Well, we do have some great chats going on and some excellent questions. I want to see if the co-panelists have any responses or questions for each other before we open it up. We have 3 great questions that I think are kind of the crux of this matter that it'll be great to get to. But I want to see if any of the other co-panelists, after hearing each other speak on this important topic, have any reflections, responses, or questions for each other before we go to the wonderful questions from the participants.
Yes, thank you so much. Rachel and I were kind of talking with each other a little bit on the side, saying that there's so many commonalities. I mean, down to the specificity of the experience of grandparents, multi-generational, the way that our knowledge is transmitted, transmuted, transcribed, misappropriated, the whole gamut, our relation to place and people, the impact of politics on how we live day to day. So just everything resonated very powerfully, and it is very uplifting to know that I think that there's more of a critical mass of us doing work in clinics and research and universities where our knowledge is privileged rather than the other way around. So Dorothy, I really loved how you really made that clear that this is the privileged knowledge, and just ignore, we're not even going to talk about what the other stuff is. It's like we are central. So mahalo, I really thank you. It's very encouraging and uplifting. It's medicine to the soul.
Yes. Mahalo miigwech Noelani for those beautiful comments, synthesizing so much of what was shared. Any others from our panelists? Or shall we move to the great questions shared? Rachel,
Have a quick,
yes.
yeah. I just wanted to say
Yeah.
thank you as well for everyone who presented and shared. Mariel, I really appreciated your sharing of your experience. I'm the head of our mental health education here at the School of Social Work. And so those are the kinds of conversations we're trying to have all the time, and focusing on people's gifts and wellness. So I really appreciated your sharing.
Thank you for
Yes,
that.
beautiful.
I hope that, I mean, I'm really excited. Like, Dorothy's been a part of my life, like for the last 20 years, to be able to, I didn't want to say anything, but I was like, oh my God, this is my first time I get to present with Dorothy. This is so amazing. How do I introduce myself? What do I say? Do I wait for it? So like, I didn't say anything. I just got nervous. This was amazing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I think the way that Chantel and all the CIS folks who organized this event really put out a pretty profound and provocative question to us. And what the first question, and he did identify them himself, but we'll just share the question. Could you talk about using Indigenous research methodologies as a non-Indigenous person? I think that's on so many young people's minds right now, and the way that the CIS and Chantel characterized it in the flyer for this event. How do scholars from a diversity of backgrounds in increasingly challenging times appropriately adopt Indigenous research methodologies to their research from within Western academic institutions? And you all spoke to it beautifully in many different ways and grappled with those complexities. But I think it would be fantastic to hear each of you speak to that from your own experience.
Okay, I'll go.
Thank you.
I think that, as was mentioned from the beginning, relationships are like number one. Don't go into a community if you don't have a relationship already. I'm working with a non-Indigenous master's student who has made it her business to understand what it is that I need from her work. And that is monumental to me, because how many people come with all their own ideas about what we need before they actually go and, realize, oh, you actually don't need that. So, what do I do? I can't do anything. So you have to know what they want and then do it. Mostly without question. Like, you gotta do it.
Excellent. Thank you. So right on. Others?
I think along the lines of what Mariel you're sharing is that when you go into a community, it's very important that what you give and what you leave far surpasses what you're going to take from that community. In addition to understanding and knowing what they need. So relationship, like Mariel is saying, and not relationship on your individual interests terms, relationship that involves an investment of time and energy and heart and at the core of humanity. Like, what is your research going to contribute to this community, and how are they going to access it, and who is going to say so? So that relationship is really key. And the idea of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, it's really important that as an individual person or scholar or researcher, that you do your own self-searching, because everybody, if you go far enough back, you have indigeneity. There is a place that your ancestors have come from. It may be somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Germany, but people who are close to their people and their land and their place have common understanding of what humanity is. They're not going to argue about clean air and clean water. You know, so basically what Mariel said is relationship, and really think about how that resonates for you as a contributing human on this planet. Yeah.
Here. Yes,
Makes
thank
me
you.
want to
Dorothy.
speak to a story, something that happened to me in my PhD program at UBC. And this was with a non-Indigenous, very privileged white male from Toronto who was doing his PhD at UBC as well. And I found out through various networks that he was doing his research in Indigenous community. And as luck would have it, he was living in the same apartment building as I was, just above me. And he would always ask me to go for coffee. And he would ask me, he was literally draining my brain for how to act and how to be in Indigenous community. And I finally said to him one day, when are you going to pay for my coffee? When are you going to buy me lunch? When are you going to do something that's reciprocal and not just take and take and take? And I mean, it's like he didn't get it because he continued to do it. You know, and it's that he's so in his privilege that he wouldn't even allow those questions to penetrate his consciousness. You know, so I just stopped. Like, he's tried to friend me on Facebook and he sends me emails, you know, and I've just had to block him, you know, because he's a taker, you know, and that's total exploitation of me, absolutely disrespectful of the knowledge that I carry, you know. So why would I want to build a relationship in this way? You know, so I find that the 4 R's, you know, is usually good guiding principles in terms of respect, reciprocity, relevance, and what's the other one? I can't remember the 4th one. And then they're, you know, they've been expanded by different scholars. But if you look up Kirkness and Barnhart, you'll get those 4 principles. You know, so they talk about relationship building and reciprocity between peoples or in the community. It's like when you go into a community, you don't just think that you're going to go in there. It's like when I was in film and television. No way I could think that I could fly in with a camera crew and stick a mic in someone's face and ask them to give me a story. You know, I did my pre-production for weeks before I would bring the camera crew in, you know, and I would send them a copy of my work so they could see how I approached Indigenous story, you know. So it's like there just seems to be a block, a mental block about thinking with that superior attitude that they actually have a right to just come in and take. So I just needed to share that story because it seemed to be on point.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Critical. Rachel, would you like to share on this
Yeah.
question? I think as a settler scholar, as you self-proclaimed.
Yeah. I think, what everyone said pretty much covers it. I think really knowing yourself, I can speak from my own personal experience, knowing yourself and why, asking yourself why you want to do this work. Because first of all, if you can't articulate that question of why, people aren't going to want to talk to you and you're not going to get a job after you graduate. So that's one thing. And, I think I'll say it bluntly, if you're already at the point of this is my project, well, then that's your project. That's not something you're building through relationship. And so that's beyond the point of being able to incorporate these methodologies, because again, you have to start with the relationship and then find out what the people you're working with need. And then just reinforcing, I think what Marielle said about, you do, unless it's like completely unethical, which it wouldn't be, you do what you're told and what you're asked to do. And people don't seem to understand this a lot of the time. Like, it might be the first thing you're asked to do is go volunteer at a community event or just go attend an event. And if you say, oh, well, like, no, I don't understand, or you ignore that invitation, that maybe that was your one chance, and you blew it. So again, building relationships over time. And I think it's okay, it's okay to realize like you're not going to be able to do this for your dissertation, and that's fine. It's about finding maybe one step that you can take towards doing things in a better way right now, and then when you're someplace where you're gonna be, and you can build relationships and invest that time and emotional energy and not just do a project and leave, then you start that more intense work.
Yes, Dorothy. Thank you, Rachel.
I just want to address Brad's question about non-Indigenous people using Indigenous research methodologies. And Brad, I think you're the same person that contacted me by email. And if you read my methodology chapter, you'll see how complex it is. But the bottom line, I think, is for non-Indigenous researchers to acknowledge the scholarship of Indigenous peoples and to acknowledge where you're getting that practice from. Don't assume that it's your own. And I would really strongly recommend, as Rachel said, to answer the why question for yourself. Because when you're answering that why question and be truthful with yourself, and it may take you back to your home country or your ancestral place, wherever that may be. And I know that there is an awakening, all across the globe, so there are many knowledges. And I think that we're all people of color and Black people are coming together, and we're saying that this doesn't necessarily work for us, excuse me, that there are other ways of seeing the world and living in the world. And, and I think that we need to look at world knowledge in terms of the academy. We can't assume that Euro-Western knowledge is the top of the pinnacle. We have to consider ourselves equal to that knowledge. And I think that Indigenous knowledges hold such a depth and scope of knowledge that is so beneficial to the planet right now, you know, and we need to just all work together in that way, you know. So I would really strongly suggest that, Brad, if you're listening, if you're still there. So that's it. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for speaking directly in answering his question. Well, that was, I think, one of the most provocative questions, and you all addressed that really beautifully. Chantel, I'll take your lead on timing here. As the main organizer of the event. We've got, looks like 67 people hanging in there really well, which is fantastic. I can go all night with these brilliant women, but I want to be mindful of folks' time too. And
Well, Melissa,
Chantel?
I was just going to suggest for those panelists who would like to remain to answer one more question, because I know students are really lapping this up. I would be happy to keep the forum open for that. If there's anyone who needs to pop off, then I, you know, please do. And you can sort of just, Melissa, choose from the remaining questions what you think would be most pertinent for the speakers to address.
Perfect. Well, I think these two follow-up questions are really fantastic as well. An anonymous attendee asked the question, do you think it would be helpful to have a special place for Indigenous peoples to study our own cultural knowledge on our own terms outside of any Western academic institution? Powerful question. And then the fabulous Lila June, hey Lila, responded, or maybe a better way to phrase that is, what are the limitations you come up against when researching in the Western Academy or academia? Could that be eliminated if we made our own space for teaching and learning? So beautiful. Multi-part question. So if any of the panelists would like to respond to that, that would be fabulous.
I'll start. Yes, and yes, but mostly I feel like we need, in my particular study, I need to be able to embody everything 4 seasons about village life. What does that mean? And I need to be able to go close the door and say, okay, this is it for the next 5-10 years, whatever it takes. That's gonna be the education. I feel like I'm a child in my knowledge. I don't know anything. I'm already getting a PhD and I don't know nothing. Like this is ridiculous. We need to know, and we need to have space to be able to do that before we can even open it up to share with anybody. That's kind of what I've been trying to play with in education, with my children's education, knowing, seeing, because we all came from the same high school, myself, my mom, my sister, my 2 eldest children, and then my youngest was the experiment, and she's like super smart now because she knows other things outside of high school, which is not always good, because if you don't follow this prescribed path, you get pushed off it, or you get left behind, or all of these things. And this is what's happening in education. And then when you take a look at what's happening outside of education and how the other industries are being affected by piss poor education that's coming from the Western, it's like, what are we even doing? You know, in Canada, there was a woman who literally recorded her death on Facebook and had educated, post-secondary educated healthcare workers being racist to her on her deathbed in the Canadian hospital. That's education for you. So yes, we need to be able to close the door, have our own village knowledge come back to us so that we can say, okay, This is what's got to happen now. We need to build a scaffold between these two canoes, because if you know the wampum belt, the Constitution is based on that. These two canoes in one river. How do we stop the other canoe from keeping to try to pull us down and drown us in our own river? Like, we need to have a scaffolding of education so that the two societies can find method and meaning and ways around and secure, because we're all gonna drown otherwise.
Powerful. Thank you, Marielle, for bringing up that historical Haudenosaunee-Turo Wampum metaphor and story for our knowledge systems and our ways in the universities. Others? Dorothy.
I talked about this in my dissertation writing as well. And I know that I purposefully created an Indigenous cohort at UBC so that I would have support, you know, throughout my process, because otherwise, you know, the isolation of doing this kind of work is draining. But one of the things that I came to see and understand is that as Indigenous scholars, we are carrying two loads. We're reclaiming our own Indigenous knowledges and figuring out, like Marielle's going, you know, learning and wanting to figure out the theories. I created a theory in my master's, you know, and in my PhD, but we also have on top of that, we have to learn the Euro-Western theorists and who are the most applicable to the work that we're doing, and to find critical thinkers who are open enough to embrace Indigenous knowledge. You know, so I think that that needs to be acknowledged. You know, that I know that in my job now at SFU, you know, people keep talking about the emotional labor that I have to put in terms of my job. And this is not just for me, but for faculty and other Indigenous staff. You know, so everybody's got the terms down pat, you know, but when it comes down to, you know, it's like, hang on, I worked 2 12-hour days this week, so I'm going to, or if you end up like I serve on the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Advisory, and it's like engaging in these really intense topics of racism, right? It was like after George Floyd was murdered, I mean, I had 2 meltdowns in meetings that I had within my unit, you know, because here we are going along as if nothing had happened in the world and pretending as if the world was just going on. Meanwhile, out on the streets all over the globe, you know, people are putting their lives in jeopardy to go and stand up, you know, with these social injustices that were happening. You know, so it's like we have to carry 2 loads, and we have to learn how to balance that for our own mental health, you know, and it's tough, right? And so when you're living in a society that totally erases you at every turn, I mean, I totally understand why some of my cousins ended up in mental institutions back in the 50s, you know, because they were taken away from the land, taken away from their family, you know, so I mean, it doesn't surprise me because it just goes against everything that's in here in our genetics and how we live our lives on the planet, you know, so yeah, I mean, it's a double workload that we need to acknowledge that goes on for Indigenous scholars. Thank you for allowing me my rant.
Oh, no, that's so important. Thank you, Dorothy. Yes. Tiffany wrote on the chat, pure wisdom. Yeah, speaking truth. Does Rachel or Noelani have a comment on that question about Indigenous only spaces for our knowledge sharing and learning and teaching and growing?
I'm being told to go first. I think it's a beautiful idea. I don't think, well, I was thinking I was gonna say my opinion on the matter doesn't matter that much, but I think as a non-Indigenous person doing this work in the academy, I see, I don't know, my kind of secret understanding of my role is, I guess, like institutional espionage in a way. Like my role is to be here and to use the power that I have access to support the communities that I care about. And so I think, you know, even in a way, as you know, non-Indigenous people, those opinions do matter because you might be in the area where you could help write a grant or you could help with an effort like that, even though you wouldn't be the person who's the beneficiary of, you know, of that effort. And so that's, I guess, kind of my answer. Yes, it would be beautiful and we should work towards that. But with the understanding that there do need to be Indigenous spaces for Indigenous people, because to be honest, the academy, especially the neoliberal academy, it's not a healthy place. And it's certainly not a healthy place for when your values and your core of yourself comes from a different tradition than that's privileged in the academy.
Thank you, Rachel. Noelani?
I know she switched to
Oh
phone
yeah,
audio,
I think
and I'm not sure if we're able
it's
to
working.
hear her.
Yes, we can see you. Oh, a little bit now. Try again.
Got a phone. I think talking the phone. Can you hear me through the phone? Yeah.
Yes, that's good.
I was thinking, you know, and I mentioned earlier on in terms of the Hawaii situation and the politics of Hawaii being not America. And so the University of Hawaii is an institution that was established prior to American occupation. And so when we think about should we create spaces, and I'm speaking to Hawaii in particular, however, I like what Dorothy was saying in terms of privileging not just our knowledge, but our space. You know, why are we thinking to create something elsewhere? There was a young person who's, I remember before she was born, her mother is very much active in Hawaiian education and the pedagogy of aloha and Hawaiian epistemology and ways of knowing. And she did this, I don't know if it was an Instagram or something, but basically she was like, hey, how about this idea? How about we have haole homesteads? So haole means foreigner, basically. It's a very gross interpretation of foreigner. So similar to, I think, the ideas of reservations on Turtle Island, you know, these quote unquote reservations are places where we were put as nations, like, okay, you guys are assigned here. And in Hawaii, we have was called Hawaiian Homestead. So this young girl whose parents have been very active in advocating for Indigenous space is saying, hey, why do we have a Hawaiian homestead? We need a Haole homestead. We are the home base. And so I think philosophically and practically that may not be something to be achieved like in the immediate. And so we do create, like I really resonate with what Dorothy was saying, where you create support groups to get through research and grad school. And like teaching our children, I think Mariel was talking about just educating our children to really frame their place and their thinking as we privilege our place, we advocate our place. When we're advocating, we're viewed as protesters or activists, and which connotate negative terms. But really, we're accessing ancestral knowledge and privileging ancestral place, and in the case of Hawaii, legal space and place. So just thinking about, do we create like our own space? I agree with what Mario was saying, is that, yeah, we need our space and we need seasons to go through and go the journey without the interruption. And so, you know, like Dorothy was saying, I'm not going to address the colonized or the colonial frame. We're just going to privilege our knowledge and go from there. So I would say yes and yes, and really think about how we think about these things. That's it.
Mahalo. Thank you. And it looks like Dorothy has to go. Oh, thank you so much, Dorothy. And thank you all for staying in there 2.5 hours. Incredible sharing of knowledge and wisdom and teachings and art and story and language. It was my honor, truly my honor, to moderate this panel with you. And I think we pushed the conversation a bit further. And you listeners and students, I hope you have lots of food for thought with great examples, great models, great case studies, and some do's and don'ts of decolonizing in research methodologies. So thank you for being here with us this beautiful evening and new moon, wherever you are, Mother Earth and the new moon shining on you wherever you are. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for holding space for us this evening. We really appreciate it.
Yes, great. My pleasure. Be well, everyone. Have a good, safe evening. Hope your families are staying safe during these crazy times, and hope to keep in touch through the CIS network. Have a good night. Thank you.